of this trouble begin?
Living in America. There's nothing wrong.
Nothing wrong at all. You're not in any difficulty, but you're out on bond.
Because
Why
I
do you
look
think
good.
that is? You
I
look
smell good. I
Yes.
feel good.
And you sing good.
James Brown had just been arrested for beating his wife with a lead pipe and firing a gun at her car. When CNN asked how the trouble began, he burst into song.
Have all the charges been dropped?
Yeah, I'm out on love.
Well, are you out on love or out of love? Which is it?
Out on love. Alone from night to night, you find me.
Out on love, while facing charges that could send him to prison for decades. The Godfather of Soul was high on PCP, delusional, and about to destroy his career in 14 minutes of live television.
About that?
Gracias, señor, te quiero mucho. No, Dankeschön. I'm concerned because there's nothing wrong.
What happened next would transform James Brown from soul legend to public disgrace, one disturbing answer at a time. So let's get into it. 3 weeks before that infamous CNN appearance, James Brown was living in a world that barely resembled reality. By the mid-1980s, it was widely alleged that Brown was using drugs, with Vicki Anderson confirming to journalist Barney Hoskins that Brown's regular use of PCP, colloquially known as angel dust, began before 1982. What started as recreational drug use had mutated into something far more sinister. The transformation was gradual at first, then catastrophic. The man who once commanded stages across the world now spent his days in a chemical haze, convinced that trees contained surveillance equipment and that shadowy figures were monitoring his every move. Once, while traveling in a car under the influence of PCP, which he continued to procure dependent on its availability, Brown alleged that passing trees contained psychotronic surveillance technology. The paranoia wasn't entirely unfounded. James Brown had been under FBI surveillance since the late 1960s, but the drugs had twisted legitimate concerns into full-blown delusions. His staff noticed the change immediately. Where Brown had once been demanding but professional, he became erratic and violent. Musicians who had worked with him for years suddenly found themselves walking on eggshells, never knowing when a routine rehearsal might explode into accusations of betrayal or conspiracy. The creative process that had produced revolutionary music became a minefield of paranoid outbursts and drug-fueled rages. His third wife, Adrienne Rodriguez, wasn't helping matters. After he met and later married Adrienne Rodriguez in 1984, she and Brown began using PCP together. Their relationship became a toxic cycle of drug abuse and violence that would define Brown's final decades. A member of Brown's kitchen staff even claimed that Rodriguez put PCP into his creamed corn and coffee ice cream. Whether this was revenge or enablement, the result was the same. James Brown was rarely sober. The couple's drug binges would last for days, with both Brown and Rodriguez disappearing into a haze of PCP that made time seem to speed up and slow down simultaneously. Friends and associates described visiting the Brown household and finding it in complete chaos. Broken furniture, shattered glass, and the couple either screaming at each other or passed out in drug-induced stupors. The violence escalated with frightening regularity. Between 1984 and his September 1988 arrest, Adrienne Brown had to call 911 to report domestic violence a whopping 12 times. Each incident followed the same pattern: explosive rage fueled by PCP, followed by police intervention, arrest, and eventually dropped charges when Adrienne refused to testify. The local sheriff's department knew the Browns' address by heart, responding to calls that ranged from domestic disturbances to reports of gunfire.
Wife and I, we take it on the chin and we give it back to them and our soul. It wasn't easy for Moses, Christ. It wasn't easy for Job. And it certainly won't be easy for me.
By April 1988, James Brown wasn't just battling addiction. He was losing touch with basic human decency. In one incident, Rodriguez reported to authorities that Brown beat her with an iron pipe and shot at her car. The scene was horrifying. Neighbors heard screaming, then gunshots, then the sound of Adrian's car speeding away with bullet holes in the trunk. The charges were serious: assault with intent to murder. For anyone else, this would mean the end of their freedom. For James Brown, it was just another Tuesday. His behavior had become so erratic that even his closest associates were afraid. Band members would arrive at recording sessions never knowing which version of James Brown would show up. The brilliant perfectionist who had revolutionized soul music, or the paranoid drug addict who saw enemies everywhere. Most days, it was the latter. Studio engineers reported having to clear weapons from recording booths before sessions could begin. The entertainment industry, which had long protected Brown because of his talent and earning power, was running out of patience. Concert promoters were fielding complaints from venues about Brown's increasingly unpredictable behavior. Insurance companies were raising premiums. Even his most loyal supporters were beginning to question whether the Godfather of Soul had finally crossed a line from which there was no return. The April arrest should have been a wake-up call. Instead, it was the moment James Brown decided to wage war against reality itself. Rather than seek help or lay low, he chose to go on national television and prove to the world that he was still in control. It was the worst decision of his life. CNN's Atlanta studio felt electric on April 4th, but not in the way anyone anticipated. James Brown arrived wearing his signature yellow-tinted sunglasses, a choice that would prove prophetic. He was about to see everything through a distorted lens. The production crew noticed something was off immediately. Brown's movements were erratic, his speech patterns unusual, and his eyes held a glassy quality that suggested he wasn't entirely present. Host Sonia Friedman had covered controversial figures before, but nothing had prepared her for what was about to unfold. She had researched Brown's legal troubles extensively, preparing questions that would allow him to explain his side while maintaining journalistic integrity. Her first question was straightforward, almost sympathetic. How did all of this trouble begin? It was an invitation for Brown to explain his side, to show remorse, or at least acknowledge the severity of the situation. Instead, James Brown launched into the chorus of "Living in America," his voice carrying that familiar power, but his eyes betraying something far more unsettling.
How did all of this trouble begin?
Living in America. There's nothing wrong.
Nothing wrong at all. You're not in any difficulty, but you're out on bond.
The disconnect was jarring. Here was a man facing charges that could send him to prison for decades, yet he seemed genuinely confused about why anyone would consider this problematic. Brown seems only dimly aware of Sonia Friedman's questions, preferring to shout the lyrics to his songs. It wasn't defiance, it was dissociation. His brain, ravaged by years of PCP abuse, appeared incapable of processing the gravity of his situation. The studio audience watched in stunned silence. This wasn't the James Brown they remembered from his triumphant performances or his role in calming racial tensions after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. This was a broken man whose grip on reality had been shattered by chemical dependency and unchecked violence.
Now, I understand that you have already... James, I have to ask you one serious question here. I understand you already have started divorce proceedings. Does that mean that you're now eligible?
Yes, I'm eligible. I'm singing. I want to mingle.
The casual way he dismissed his marriage troubles while facing assault charges against his wife revealed someone completely detached from consequences. Friedman's professionalism was remarkable. She maintained composure while watching a legend self-destruct in real time. Behind the cameras, crew members exchanged concerned glances. Some had worked with Brown before, during his peak years, and remembered him as demanding but coherent. This version was unrecognizable. As the interview progressed, Brown's responses became increasingly bizarre. Thereafter, he continues to state that Women love him because he makes love good, all the while continuing to shout song titles out. The man who had once been called upon to calm racial tensions was now making inappropriate sexual comments on national television while facing domestic violence charges. The sexual boasting was particularly disturbing given the context. Here was a man accused of beating his wife with a metal pipe, and his response was to brag about his prowess with women. The cognitive dissonance suggested someone whose moral compass had been completely scrambled by drug abuse and unchecked ego. The most disturbing moment came when Brown began promoting his gospel magazine, The Second Coming. He later even advertises a Christian magazine that he is working on, despite clearly not engaging in the principles preached therein. The irony was lost on him. A man accused of beating his wife with a lead pipe was positioning himself as a spiritual leader. Every answer revealed someone who had lost the ability to connect actions with consequences. In Brown's drug-addled mind, he was still the beloved entertainer who could charm his way out of any situation. He hadn't grasped that this time was different. The cameras were capturing every delusional moment, preserving his breakdown for posterity. What should have been damage control became evidence of his complete disconnection from reality. The aftermath of the CNN interview was swift and merciless. Within hours, clips were being replayed across news networks, but not as planned. Instead of damage control, James Brown had provided ammunition for every critic who had ever questioned his character. The interview aired during prime time, reaching millions of viewers who watched in horror as a childhood hero revealed himself to be deeply disturbed. It has been alleged that Brown was enduring a chronic PCP addiction at the time, and based on the evidence of the footage, the word alleged is doing very little legwork in this sentence. Television viewers who had grown up with Brown's music were watching their childhood hero reveal himself to be something far more troubling. The man who had soundtracked their youth with songs of empowerment and joy was now displaying behavior that suggested serious mental illness and moral bankruptcy. Network executives immediately began distancing themselves from Brown. MTV, which had embraced his comeback with the Living in America video, quietly removed his content from heavy rotation. Radio programmers received calls from advertisers threatening to pull sponsorships if they continued playing Brown's music. The cultural icon who had once been considered bulletproof was suddenly radioactive. The entertainment industry, which had long tolerated Brown's erratic behavior because of his talent and earning power, suddenly found him toxic. Concert promoters who had previously overlooked his legal troubles now had visual evidence of his instability. While some commentators see inherent mirth in his actions, it is worth remembering that this is not some stage performance from the celebrated star. He did indeed recently assault his wife and fire a gun at her. Venues that had been eager to book the Godfather of Soul began canceling shows. Insurance companies refused to cover events featuring Brown, citing his unpredictable behavior as an unacceptable risk. Promoters who had worked with him for years suddenly found themselves unable to return his calls. The man who had once commanded six-figure performance fees was being priced out of his own industry. Radio stations began distancing themselves from new James Brown releases. Program directors who had once guaranteed airplay for anything bearing Brown's name now treated his music like a liability. The man who had influenced everyone from Michael Jackson to Prince was suddenly being treated like a pariah. The legal system was watching too. Prosecutors who might have been willing to negotiate plea deals now had evidence of Brown's lack of remorse.
Well, it's not really a low point. I think it's a misfortune, but a lot can be gained from it. I don't feel I have to really turn it around. I feel that it's going to probably work better for me than anything I've ever had to happen to me.
Even in prison, Brown maintained the delusion that this was all part of some master plan. He couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge that his own actions had led to his downfall. The man who had once been called the hardest working man in show business had become his own worst enemy. His refusal to accept responsibility only reinforced the public perception that he was fundamentally broken. More troubling were the stories that began emerging from people who had worked with Brown during his decline. Musicians described sessions where Brown would arrive hours late, paranoid and incoherent. Sound engineers talked about having to work around his drug-induced mood swings. The creative genius that had made him legendary was being systematically destroyed by his addictions. Record label executives who had once competed for his signature now treated him like damaged goods. Atlantic Records, which had released some of his biggest hits, quietly allowed his contract to expire without renewal. Studio owners began requiring security deposits before allowing Brown to record, fearing he might damage equipment during drug-fueled rages. The CNN interview had accomplished something that decades of controversy hadn't. It made James Brown's problems impossible to ignore. Fans could no longer separate the art from the artist when the artist was publicly demonstrating his disconnection from reality. The footage became a permanent record of his fall from grace, replayed endlessly as evidence of how far the mighty had fallen. Industry insiders began sharing stories they had previously kept private. Tales of Brown's increasingly violent behavior, his paranoid accusations against band members, and his complete inability to function without drugs. The interview hadn't just damaged his reputation, it had opened the floodgates for years of suppressed testimony about his true character. The CNN interview was supposed to be James Brown's redemption tour, but it became the catalyst for his complete destruction. Within months, his behavior escalated to levels that shocked even those who thought they had seen it all. The man who had once channeled his intensity into groundbreaking performances was now directing that same energy toward increasingly dangerous confrontations with authority. The warning signs had been building for weeks. Brown's staff reported finding weapons stashed throughout his offices and recording studios. His paranoia had reached the point where he accused longtime friends and associates of being government spies. The FBI surveillance that had begun in the 1960s had become an obsession in his drug-addled mind, turning every shadow into a potential threat. On September 24, 1988, Brown's delusions reached their breaking point. He reportedly stormed into the insurance company next to his office, waving a shotgun and complaining that strangers were using his bathroom. The Godfather of Soul, high on PCP and carrying multiple weapons, had become a clear and present danger to innocent people. Witnesses described a man who seemed completely divorced from reality, screaming about conspiracies and government plots while brandishing a weapon that could have killed anyone in the room. The insurance seminar he disrupted was filled with ordinary people trying to make a living, agents, clerks, and customers who had no connection to Brown's world of celebrity and paranoia. They found themselves trapped in a nightmare scenario, held hostage by a drug-addled legend who saw enemies where none existed. Several attendees later described the terror of watching Brown's eyes dart around the room, searching for threats that existed only in his chemically altered mind. What followed was a chase scene that belonged in an action movie, not the life of a soul legend. Brown left the complex and sped off in his pickup truck. Police pursued him down Highway 20 and across the South Carolina line. The chase involved numerous vehicles and reached speeds of 60 to 85 miles per hour. The sight of James Brown's truck weaving through traffic at dangerous speeds became a metaphor for his entire life. Out of control, heading toward inevitable disaster, and endangering everyone in his path. The police response was overwhelming. Dozens of officers from multiple jurisdictions converging on a drug-addled celebrity who refused to accept reality. They shot out 2 of his tires. He drove on the rims for 6 miles. The image of James Brown's pickup truck sparking down the interstate on metal rims became a metaphor for his entire career collapse. Sparks flew as metal scraped against asphalt, creating a trail of destruction that mirrored the wreckage Brown had made of his life. But Brown's version of events, revealed years later in FBI files, painted an even darker picture. Brown later counted the bullet holes in his truck, and these totaled 23. Whether the police used excessive force or Brown's drug-induced paranoia distorted his perception, the encounter marked the end of his freedom. His claims of police brutality would later be investigated by the FBI, but the damage to his reputation was irreversible. The charges were devastating: carrying a deadly weapon at a public gathering, attempting to flee police, and driving under the influence of drugs. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison and ended up serving 3 years. For a man who had performed for presidents and been hailed as a cultural ambassador, it was a stunning fall. The news coverage focused on the bizarre details: the high-speed chase, the shotgun-wielding confrontation, the drug-fueled paranoia, creating an image of Brown as a dangerous criminal rather than a troubled artist. The prison stint should have been rock bottom, but Brown's problems ran deeper than incarceration could fix. His financial affairs were always troubled, and he fathered many children that he had no intention of raising. The man who once commanded million-dollar concert fees was now dependent on the state for room and board. His vast catalog of hits continued generating royalties, but legal fees and financial mismanagement had left him nearly broke. His wife Adrienne, the woman he had beaten and threatened to kill, visited him regularly. Their toxic relationship continued even through prison walls, with neither willing to confront the truth about their mutual destruction. In 1996, 45-year-old Adrienne underwent plastic surgery, receiving a tummy tuck, cheek implants, and other procedures, according to CNN. She would die from complications related to her PCP addiction, another casualty of their shared descent into hell. The CNN interview had been the first public glimpse of James Brown's complete disconnection from reality. Everything that followed, the armed confrontations, the high-speed chases, the prison sentence, was simply the inevitable result of that disconnection playing out to its logical conclusion.
Such a model person.
Well, if anyone know James Brown, you never see him with a frown on my face. I have a smile on my face. I thank God that I have had a chance to be what I've been. My father stopped in the 2nd grade, my mother stopped in the 4th grade, and here I am being able to turn around the music like Mozart, Schubert, Beethoven, Bach, and now you say Brown.
Even behind bars, Brown maintained his grandiose self-image, comparing himself to classical composers while serving time for assault and drug possession. The cognitive dissonance was complete. He simultaneously acknowledged his circumstances while denying their significance. The prison stint should have been rock bottom, but Brown's problems ran deeper than incarceration could fix. His financial affairs were always troubled, and he fathered many children that he had no intention of raising. The man who once commanded million-dollar concert fees was now dependent on the state for room and board. His wife Adrienne, the woman he had beaten and threatened to kill, visited him regularly. Their toxic relationship continued even through prison walls, with neither willing to confront the truth about their mutual destruction. In 1996, 45-year-old Adrienne underwent plastic surgery, receiving a tummy tuck, cheek implants, and other procedures, according to CNN. She would die from complications related to her PCP addiction, another casualty of their shared descent into hell. The CNN interview had been the first public glimpse of James Brown's complete disconnection from reality. Everything that followed, the armed confrontations, the high-speed chases, the prison sentence, was simply the inevitable result of that disconnection playing out to its logical conclusion. James Brown walked out of prison on February 27, 1991, after serving 2 years and 9 months of his 6-year sentence. The world had changed during his incarceration. Hip-hop had exploded, sampling his beats and making him relevant to a new generation who knew his music but not his madness. It should have been his second chance. Instead, it became proof that some people are incapable of learning from their mistakes. Smith fears that late in Brown's life, especially when he went back to prison, the singer may have become a joke to some people, The man who had once been taken seriously as a cultural force was now viewed as a cautionary tale. Brown's post-prison interviews revealed someone who had learned nothing from his experience. He spoke of his time behind bars as if it were a brief inconvenience rather than the consequence of his criminal behavior. To judge by R.J. Smith's The One, Brown's erratic conduct in the 1980s was going to land him in prison one way or another. The CNN interview hadn't caused his downfall. It had simply documented it. The tragic irony was that Brown's musical legacy remained untouchable. Meanwhile, the drum break from the second version of the original 1969 hit Give It Up or Turn It A Loose, the recording included on the compilation album In the Jungle Groove, became so popular at hip-hop dance parties, especially for breakdance, during the early 1980s that hip-hop pioneer Curtis Blow called the song the national anthem of hip-hop. His beats were soundtracking the future, while his behavior belonged to the past. But Brown couldn't separate his artistic genius from his personal demons. But in 1998, he reprised his antics and was arrested again on nearly identical charges, discharging a rifle, this time at his South Carolina home, and leading police on another car chase. At age 65, he was still acting out the same destructive patterns that had destroyed his career a decade earlier. The pattern continued until his death in 2006. In 2004, at age 70, he was arrested on domestic violence charges against his fourth wife. 7 decades of life had taught him nothing about treating people with basic human dignity. Looking back at that CNN interview, it's impossible not to wonder what might have been different if James Brown had used that moment for genuine reflection instead of delusional self-promotion. The man who sang I Feel Good had spent the final decades of his life making everyone around him feel terrible. The CNN interview remains a masterclass in how not to handle a crisis. In 14 minutes and 43 seconds, James Brown transformed himself from a troubled artist deserving sympathy into a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ego and untreated addiction. His music will live forever, sampled and celebrated by generations of artists who never knew the man behind the beats. But for those who watched him self-destruct on live television, the lasting image isn't of James Brown the performer. It's of James Brown the person who refused to acknowledge his own humanity until it was far too late. The hardest working man in show business had worked himself into irrelevance, one disastrous interview at a time. Anyway, that's it for this video, folks. Bye.